Joseph Patrick Kennedy possessed a fortune that rivaled the wealthiest industrialists of his era and more influence than any man in Washington. He had 9 children, a fleet of mansions, and a cold, calculated plan to dominate the next century. He was the architect of a bloodline meant to rule forever. Yet, today, the family name is synonymous with the morgue. We are told it is a Kennedy family history defined by a dark, mystical shadow, a curse. But the truth is not found in a crystal ball. It is buried in the private archives of the family's history. These records reveal the medical and psychological pressures placed upon the siblings. This file explains why the Kennedy wealth became a magnet for catastrophe. This is the autopsy of the American dynasty that bought the world, only to pay for it in blood. The Kennedy curse is the label the media uses to make sense of the carnage. From the John F. Kennedy assassination to the Robert F. Kennedy tragedy, the narrative suggests a supernatural vendetta against the Klan. We see the Chappaquiddick incident and the endless Kennedy family tragedies as proof of a cosmic debt. But if you look at the ledger, you see something different. You see a father who treated his children like venture capital. He gambled with their lives to satisfy his own ego. He built a machine so powerful that it eventually crushed the very people it was meant to protect. To understand why they died, you have to understand how they lived. You have to understand the predator who started it all. The story of the Kennedy Empire does not begin with public service. It begins with a predator. Joseph Kennedy Sr. was not a politician. He was a market manipulator. During the Roaring '20s, he mastered the art of the pump and dump. This was the Wild West of Wall Street. There were no rules, and Joe Sr. liked it that way. He would pick a stock, artificially inflate the price through fake trades and paid-off journalists, and lure in small investors. While the working class dreamed of a better life, Joe was waiting for the peak. He would pull the rug, selling his entire position and watching the price crater. He walked away with millions of dollars in profit. The people who followed his lead walked away with nothing. He was a man who saw the world as a series of targets. When he looked at the stock market, he saw a casino he could rig. When he looked at the Great Depression, he didn't see suffering, he saw an exit strategy. He liquidated his most vulnerable positions and pivoted his capital just before the crash of 1929. He didn't have a crystal ball, he had an insider's instinct for when the blood was about to hit the floor. While the rest of the country was standing in breadlines, Joe was expanding. He moved his capital into liquor. He knew Prohibition was a failing experiment. He didn't wait for the law to change. He secured the exclusive rights to import British Scotch and gin just as the end of Prohibition became inevitable. He didn't build a business, he built a trap. By the time the 21st Amendment was ratified, Joe Kennedy owned the glass. He owned the liquid. He owned the distribution. He was the gatekeeper of American vice. This wasn't about building a legacy of service. It was about building a fortress of cash. He used that cash to buy his way into the inner circles of the elite. He bought his way into the Roosevelt administration. He bought his way into the highest social circles of London. But money was just the fuel. The engine was his children. He viewed his 4 sons and 5 daughters as assets in a high-stakes portfolio. They were bred for one purpose: total power. He was a man who demanded perfection. At the dinner table, the children were grilled on world events. They were pushed to be faster, smarter, and more ruthless than anyone else. Second place was not an option in the Kennedy household. It was a sin. He was molding them into the ultimate political weapons. He wanted to erase the Irish Catholic stigma and replace it with a brand of American royalty. He was playing a global game of chess, and he was willing to sacrifice every piece to win. He believed that with enough money, you could ignore the rules of the common man. He believed he was immune to the consequences of his own greed. But the universe has a way of balancing the books. The wealth Joe accumulated was built on the backs of ruined families and broken laws. He thought he was building a sanctuary, but he was actually building a lightning rod. The pressure he placed on his children created a psychological environment where risk was the only currency. They were taught that they were untouchable. They were taught that the Kennedy name was a shield against reality. They lived at a high velocity because their father demanded nothing less. But the first payment on his debt to destiny was about to come due. The golden era was about to meet its first dark winter. The investment was about to fail in the most horrific way possible. And it all started with a secret procedure that the patriarch thought would solve a problem. But instead, it started the collapse. By 1940, the Kennedy name was no longer just a brand. It was a sovereign power. Joseph Sr. had successfully laundered his reputation from a street-fighting market manipulator to a global statesman. He was the ambassador to the court of St. James. He was a man who whispered in the ears of kings and prime ministers. His net worth had ballooned to over $400 million in today's currency. But wealth was never the finish line. It was the fuel. Joseph was playing a global game of chess with human pieces. His strategy was simple. He would buy the influence, and his sons would occupy the seats of power. He had a specific blueprint for his eldest son, Joe Jr. The boy was the golden boy. He was groomed from birth to be the first Catholic president of the United States. He was the primary investment. The other children were merely supporting cast members. But in the cold, calculated world of the Kennedy patriarch, there was no room for weakness. There was no room for a defect that could tarnish the image of biological perfection he had sold to the American public. This obsession with the family brand led to the first true horror of the Kennedy dynasty. Rosemary Kennedy, the eldest daughter, was different. She was vivacious, but she struggled with intellectual disabilities and mood swings. In the hyper-competitive environment of the Hyannisport compound, she was a liability. Joseph feared her behavior would cause a scandal that could derail Joe Jr.'s political ascent. He didn't seek a doctor, he sought a mechanic. In 1941, without his wife's knowledge, Joseph ordered a secret, experimental prefrontal lobotomy for 23-year-old Rosemary. The procedure was barbaric. Surgeons drilled into her skull while she was awake. They scraped away at her brain tissue until she stopped speaking and started incoherent babbling. The quote one was a catastrophe. Rosemary was reduced to the mental capacity of a 2-year-old. She was erased. Joseph sent her away to a private institution in Wisconsin and told the world she had become a reclusive nun. He deleted her from the family portrait to protect the stock price of the Kennedy name. It was the first time the family paid for its ambition in blood, but it would not be the last. The patriarch's calculations continued to fail. As World War II consumed the globe, Joseph's political career imploded due to his defeatist views on Nazi Germany. His dreams of the presidency shifted entirely onto Joe Jr. The pressure was immense. Joe Jr., desperate to outshine the growing reputation of his younger brother John, volunteered for a high-risk, top-secret mission in 1944. It was called Operation Aphrodite. He was to pilot a quote, _2__ bomber packed with 12 tons of high explosives and bail out before it hit its target. The plane never made it to the target. It exploded over the English Channel in a ball of fire so intense that no remains were ever recovered. The golden boy was gone. The primary investment had evaporated in a split second. The Kennedy empire was suddenly facing a total loss on its most important asset. The patriarch was devastated, but he was not finished. He was a man who knew how to pivot during a market crash. He immediately turned his cold, analytical gaze toward his second son, John. But there was a problem. John was not the athlete. He was not the hero. He was a sickly man with a crumbling spine and a secret medical file that would have ended his career before it began. This secret, hidden in the shadows of the 1944 disaster, was the real reason the family became a magnet for tragedy. It was a ticking time bomb buried in the family's DNA. And Joseph was about to spend millions to make sure the world never saw the fuse. The transition from Joe Jr. to John was not a passing of the torch. It was a hostile takeover of a human life. John, known to his friends as Jack, never wanted the crown. He was an intellectual, a writer, a man who preferred the quiet corners of a library to the roar of a campaign trail. But in the Kennedy household, the individual did not exist. There was only the mission. Joseph Sr. looked at his second son and saw a flawed product that needed a massive injection of marketing capital. The 1950s became the decade of the Kennedy monopoly. Joseph understood a fundamental truth about American democracy that his rivals missed. He understood that an election is just a high-end retail transaction. To win, you didn't need the best ideas, you needed the best distribution network. He used his vast wealth to bypass the traditional gatekeepers of the Democratic Party. He didn't ask for permission. He bought the infrastructure. He leveraged his old bootlegging connections, his ties to organized labor, and his Wall Street millions to grease every wheel from Boston to Chicago. They lived in the compound at Hyannisport, a sprawling private kingdom that served as the war room for the family's expansion. From this fortress, Joseph directed the movement of cash and influence like a general moving divisions on a map. He bought the television time. He bought the newspaper endorsements. He even bought the appearance of health. Behind the scenes, the image of the tanned, athletic war hero was a meticulously crafted lie. John was falling apart. He suffered from Addison's disease, a failure of the adrenal glands that left him perpetually exhausted and in constant pain. His back was a wreckage of failed surgeries. He spent half his life on crutches or in rocking chairs, pumped full of painkillers, amphetamines, and steroids to maintain the illusion of vigor. The medical bills were staggering, but the cost of the cover-up was higher. The family's public relations machine, funded by the patriarch's bottomless pockets, worked 24 hours a day to ensure that no photograph of a sickly Jack ever reached the public. They sold the youth. They sold the future. It was the ultimate quote-for scheme. They inflated the value of the candidate until the entire nation was invested. By 1960, the investment paid off. John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States. His brother Robert was installed as Attorney General. It was a vertical integration of the federal government. The Kennedys had achieved what no other American family had ever dreamed of. They were the closest thing to royalty a republic could produce. They were untouchable. They were gods walking among men, protected by a wall of money and the Secret Service. But the problem with reaching the summit is that there is nowhere left to go but down. The family had spent decades manipulating the laws of finance and politics to their advantage. They believed they had mastered the world. They believed their bank balance could shield them from the consequences of their father's ruthless climb to the top. But as they sat in the Oval Office, planning the next 100 years of their dynasty, they failed to realize that they had become the ultimate targets. They had built a throne out of glass, and the first stones were already being gathered in the shadows of the very institutions they now controlled. The 1950s were not a decade for the Kennedys. They were a coronation. By this point, Joseph Sr. had stopped playing by the rules of the market. He was writing them. He understood a fundamental truth of the American psyche. People do not vote for policies, they vote for aesthetics. He didn't just want his sons in the White House. He wanted to own the very concept of the American dream. He viewed the United States government as a distressed asset, ripe for a hostile takeover. To do this, he needed more than just cash. He needed a monopoly on the narrative. The Kennedy machine was a marvel of financial engineering. Joseph Sr. had amassed a fortune that made the old money elites of New York look like amateurs. We are talking about $400 million in 1950s currency. Adjusted for inflation, that is a multi-billion-dollar war chest dedicated to a single family brand. He used his bootlegging connections from the Prohibition era to grease the palms of the Democratic machine in Chicago and West Virginia. He didn't ask for permission. He bought the infrastructure. He understood that in a democracy, the loudest voice is the one that pays for the microphone. The epicenter of this private kingdom was the compound at Hyannisport, 6 acres of waterfront property that served as the family's strategic command center. It was a world of white linen suits, private screening rooms, and touch football games designed for the cameras of Life magazine. This was the laboratory where the Kennedy myth was perfected. They were the closest thing to royalty America had ever seen. They had the private jets when most people were still taking the train. They had the movie star mistresses, including the most famous woman in the world, Marilyn Monroe. They lived in a vacuum of absolute privilege, where the laws of the common man were merely suggestions. John was the face, Robert was the fist. While John charmed the nation with his calculated charisma, Robert was the ruthless enforcer who ensured the family's interests were protected at any cost. As Attorney General, Robert turned the Department of Justice into a weapon. They weren't just politicians, they were a paramilitary organization dressed in Brooks Brothers tailoring. They occupied the highest offices in the land, not to serve, but to dominate. It was a total monopoly on power, fueled by a father's obsession and a bottomless pit of Wall Street millions. But the problem with building a kingdom on a foundation of secrets is that the weight eventually becomes too much for the structure to bear. The Kennedys were operating on borrowed time. They had reached the absolute peak of the mountain. They were untouchable. They were gods. They had successfully transitioned from the sons of a market manipulator to the leaders of the free world. The investment had paid off. The portfolio was complete. But in the world of high-stakes power, the higher you climb, the harder the wind blows. And the wind was starting to pick up. They were blinded by their own brilliance. They believed that because they had bought the system, they were immune to the system's volatility. They were living as if the rules of physics didn't apply to people with their bank balance. They ignored the warnings. They ignored the enemies they had made on the way up. They thought they had reached the end of history. They didn't realize that they were standing on a trapdoor. The golden era was about to meet a lead-colored reality. Because when you play a game against destiny, destiny always gets the last move. And the move destiny was preparing for the Kennedys would be televised in high definition. The foundation didn't just crack, it shattered. On a bright afternoon in November 1963, the family's perceived invincibility was deleted in a matter of seconds. In Dallas, the leader of the free world was eliminated on live television, his life ending in the back of a custom Lincoln Continental that offered no protection against a cheap Italian rifle. The image of the Camelot King, bloodied in the arms of his wife, became the first true fracture in the Kennedy psychological armor. The world mourned a president, but Joseph Sr. mourned a failed investment. His masterpiece had been destroyed before the first term was even finished. The family reacted to the horror the only way they knew how. They doubled down on the risk. They treated grief like a competitor to be outplayed. 5 years later, Robert attempted to reclaim the throne. He ran a campaign fueled by raw emotion and the same dark money that had fueled his brother's rise. He was the Shadow Prince, the man who knew where all the bodies were buried because he had helped dig the holes. But the cycle repeated with a cold, mathematical precision. In a hotel kitchen in Los Angeles, the second pillar of the dynasty was taken out. The dream of a Kennedy restoration was no longer a political strategy. It was a suicide pact. The financial empire continued to grow, but the human cost was becoming unsustainable. At this point, the family was worth over $500 million, controlled through a labyrinth of trusts and the massive merchandise mart in Chicago. They owned more square footage than some cities. Yet, the money couldn't buy a sense of self-preservation. The family was obsessed with the high-velocity lifestyle their father had curated. They lived as if the rules of physics didn't apply to people with their bank balance. They flew their own planes through coastal fog without instrument ratings. They skied into trees at high speeds while playing games of catch. This wasn't a mystical curse. This was a psychological byproduct of extreme privilege and the desperate, crushing need to outrun the shadow of their father's sins. Joseph Sr. had raised them to believe that coming in second was a death sentence. He had bred them to be predators, but he forgot that predators are often the primary targets of the environment. The reckless behavior wasn't a flaw in the system, it was the system itself. They were addicted to the adrenaline of the climb because the view from the top was the only thing that made the sacrifice of their sister Rosemary feel justified. But even as the bodies piled up, the family's PR machine worked overtime to maintain the illusion of vigor. They were the masters of the spin. They used their influence in the media to bury reports of chronic illness, drug dependencies, and the mounting toll of their internal rot. They were a house made of glass, pretending to be a fortress made of stone. The world saw the yachts and the weddings, but they didn't see the medical bills or the legal settlements. The debt to destiny was compounding, and the interest rate was lethal. The third generation was about to inherit a throne that was already on fire. The foundation did not just crack, it shattered. The Kennedy myth was built on a premise of invincibility, but in November 1963, that premise was liquidated on live television. The family had spent decades and millions of dollars constructing a fortress of public relations, yet they forgot one fundamental law of power. The higher the pedestal, the cleaner the shot. Dallas was not just a tragedy, it was a systemic failure of the Kennedy security apparatus. The world watched as the leader of the free world was eliminated in broad daylight. The image of the blood-stained Chanel suit became the new family crest. But the horror was only the beginning of a much deeper erosion. The patriarch, Joseph Sr., was now a prisoner of his own body, silenced by a massive stroke. He watched from a wheelchair as the empire he built began to consume itself. The discipline he enforced with an iron fist vanished. In his absence, the family's inherent attraction to danger took the wheel. They were obsessed with risk. It was in their marrow. They treated the laws of physics like they treated the laws of Washington. They were suggestions, not rules. 5 years after Dallas, the cycle repeated. Robert Kennedy was the family's last hope for a restoration of the throne. He was the attorney general who had gone to war with the mob, the very same men his father had once done business with in the back rooms of Chicago and New York. This was the ultimate family contradiction. They used the underworld to climb, then tried to use the law to burn the ladder. In a hotel kitchen in Los Angeles, the debt was collected. Another brother gone, another funeral watched by millions. The Kennedy name was no longer associated with the White House. It was becoming synonymous with the morgue. The financial empire continued to grow, fueled by massive real estate holdings like the Merchandise Mart. But the human cost was becoming unsustainable. The remaining siblings and the burgeoning third generation operated under a cloud of terminal privilege. They believed their bank balance granted them immunity from consequence. They lived at a pace that the human heart cannot sustain. They flew their own planes without proper licenses. They skied down mountains at lethal speeds. They chased adrenaline because the mundane world of high finance was no longer enough to make them feel alive. This was not a mystical curse. This was a psychological byproduct of extreme wealth and the desperate need to outrun the shadow of their father's sins. When you are raised to believe you are a god, you eventually try to fly. But the sun always melts the wax. The family was physically falling apart, hiding behind a curtain of expensive suits and calculated smiles. They were a dynasty of ghosts, waiting for the next collision. The world looked at them with pity, but if you looked closer at the ledgers, you would see a family that was spiritually bankrupt, long before they ran out of heirs. The pressure to maintain the illusion was turning the Kennedy bloodline into a pressure cooker, and the lid was about to blow off. The public saw a series of accidents. A cold historian sees a pattern of reckless entitlement. They were a family that refused to hear the word no. Not from the law, not from their rivals, and certainly not from nature. They were convinced that the Kennedy name was a shield that could stop bullets and steer planes through storms. They were wrong. Every time they pushed the limit, the universe pushed back harder. The prestige was fading, the power was leaking, and the secret medical file from 1944 was still sitting in that Boston vault, holding the key to why this family was biologically programmed for disaster. The most golden boy of them all was about to take his final flight, and he wouldn't be flying alone. Chapter 5. The collapse of the Kennedy myth reached its terminal velocity with the next generation. This was the era where the gloss finally wore off the gold, revealing the rot beneath. The open loop from the beginning of our story, that specific locked medical file from 1944, finally provides the clinical explanation for the family's disintegration. It wasn't just about Rosemary's lobotomy. That file contained the documented reality of a bloodline that was physically failing while projecting an image of ultimate vitality. John F. Kennedy had been marketed as the picture of youth and vigor, the __6___ president who played touch football on the lawn of Hyannisport. The reality was a man who spent his life in agonizing pain, kept upright by a cocktail of experimental drugs and a back brace that ironically prevented him from ducking when the first shot rang out in Dallas. He suffered from Addison's disease, an endocrine disorder that the family machine spent millions to keep hidden from the electorate. They understood that in the theater of American power, weakness is a capital offense. They chose to lie, creating a precedent of deception that the next generation would inherit as a birthright. By the time the 1990s arrived, the family was no longer a political juggernaut. It was a celebrity circus. The third generation, the grandchildren of Joseph Sr., were born into a world where the money was guaranteed, but the purpose was gone. They had the trust funds, but they lacked the mission. Without the patriarch's iron hand to guide them, the Kennedy curse transitioned from political assassinations to self-inflicted wounds. The reckless behavior that Joseph Sr. had cultivated as a competitive advantage turned into a terminal flaw. In 1999, the last hope for a true Kennedy restoration rested on the shoulders of John F. Kennedy Jr. He was the Prince of America. He had the looks, the name, and the media empire with George Magazine. But he also had the family's fatal flaw, the belief that the rules of the physical world were negotiable for a Kennedy. On a hazy July night, despite being an inexperienced pilot with an injured ankle, he decided to fly his Piper Saratoga over the Atlantic toward Martha's Vineyard. He flew into the black hole, a patch of ocean where the horizon disappears and the senses betray the mind. He wasn't a victim of a conspiracy, he was a victim of spatial disorientation, the inability to tell up from down without looking at the instruments. It was the ultimate metaphor for the entire dynasty. When his plane hit the water at 300 miles per hour, the original plan Joseph Sr. had drafted in the 1920s finally reached its conclusion. The investment was liquidated. The __quote_9__ was gone, and with him, the last shred of the family's political capital. The family trust funds remained, but the dream was bankrupt. They had spent a century trying to buy immortality, only to find that the ocean doesn't care about your last name. The water was cold, the impact was final, and the silence that followed was the sound of an empire ending. The collapse of the Kennedy myth reached its terminal velocity with the next generation. For decades, the public saw a family of bronze god athletes and charismatic statesmen. This was a carefully curated fiction. It was a product of the most expensive public relations machine in human history. But remember that locked safe deposit box in Boston? Remember the medical file from 1944? This is where the open loop finally closes. The file didn't just contain the gruesome details of Rosemary's lobotomy. It contained the proof that the Kennedy DNA was a ticking time bomb. The world was told that John F. Kennedy was a picture of health and vigor. The reality was a medical horror story. He suffered from Addison's disease. His adrenal glands were failing. He was being kept alive by a cocktail of steroids and amphetamines that would have killed an average man. He was in constant, agonizing pain from a disintegrating spine. The family spent millions of dollars to hide this. They bribed doctors. They scrubbed records. They understood a fundamental rule of power. Weakness is a contagion. If the public knew the president was a walking pharmacy, the monopoly would end. This culture of deception filtered down to the children. They were taught that they were special. They were taught that the rules of the physical world were merely suggestions for people with their last name. This psychological conditioning created a lethal cocktail of entitlement and recklessness. By the late 1960s and 70s, the next generation began to disintegrate under the weight of the father's ambition. They weren't just chasing ghosts. They were trying to outrun a shadow that was hard-coded into their bloodline. David Kennedy died in a hotel room in 1984. Michael Kennedy died hitting a tree while playing football on skis. These weren't just accidents. They were the inevitable result of a family philosophy that prioritized risk over reality. The patriarch, Joseph Sr., had built a machine designed for total domination, but he forgot to install the brakes. He raised his children to be predators, but they ended up as prey to their own impulses. Then came the final act. The last hope for a Kennedy restoration rested on the shoulders of John F. Kennedy Jr. He was the Prince of America. He was the most famous man in the world. He was the living embodiment of his father's legacy. In 1999, he attempted to fly his private plane to Martha's Vineyard. He was an inexperienced pilot. The weather was deteriorating. Any rational person would have stayed on the ground. But a Kennedy does not wait for the weather. When his plane hit the Atlantic Ocean, it wasn't just a pilot error. It was the final payment on the debt Joseph Sr. had incurred in the 1920s. The father had used his wealth to buy the world, but he couldn't buy a reprieve from the laws of physics. The medical file from 1944 had already predicted this end. It showed a family that was physically and psychologically fragile, held together only by the sheer force of their father's bank account. The dream of a Kennedy dynasty died in that water. The political capital was officially bankrupt. The family name, once a symbol of the future, had become a relic of the past. The massive PR machine finally ran out of fuel. The world stopped looking at them as gods and started looking at them as a tragedy. The investment Joe Sr. made in 1944 had finally matured. The interest was paid in full. The empire was gone, leaving behind only a trail of headlines and a mountain of unanswered questions. The golden era was over, and the cold reality of the family's decline was all that remained for the heirs to inherit. Chapter 6. The Kennedy fortune did not disappear overnight. It evaporated through the slow, agonizing process of dilution. When Joseph Sr. died in 1969, he left behind a massive, complex web of trusts designed to protect his heirs from the taxman and themselves. But a fortune divided by 30 is no longer a fortune. It is a subsidy. The massive real estate holdings that once anchored the family's power were liquidated. The Merchandise Mart in Chicago, a 4 million square foot behemoth that was once the largest building in the world, was sold to Vornado Realty Trust for over $600 million. It was the crown jewel of the Kennedy portfolio, and when it left their hands, the family lost its seat at the table of the American oligarchy. Today, the money is silent. It has moved from the aggressive front lines of bootlegging and market manipulation into the quiet, sterile world of diversified index funds and charitable foundations. The modern Kennedys are no longer kingmakers. They are activists, authors, and minor diplomats living on the interest of a ghost. They inhabit the mansions, but they no longer rule the rooms inside them. The family name remains a powerful brand, but in the world of high finance, a brand without a product is just a memory. They have become the very thing Joseph Sr. loathed most: spectators. The empire is a cautionary tale of the ultimate cost of unchecked ambition. Joseph Sr. believed that if he accumulated enough capital and enough influence, he could insulate his bloodline from the tragedies of the common man. He was wrong. Wealth is a shield, but it is also a target. He built a private kingdom at Hyannisport, thinking he was creating a fortress. Instead, he created a vacuum. By stripping his children of the need to struggle, he stripped them of the instincts required to survive the very world he won for them. The Kennedy story proves a cold, mathematical truth about dynasties. Gravity always wins. You can spend millions to project an image of health while your body fails. You can buy the presidency to hide the sins of the past. You can fly your own planes into the dark to prove you are untouchable. But eventually, the bill comes due. The family conquered the world, only to realize that the world is a very small place when you have nowhere left to hide from your own name. Wealth can buy you a seat at the head of the table, but it cannot buy you a way out of the consequences of how you got there. The Kennedys spent a century trying to outrun the shadow of a predator, only to find that the shadow was their only true inheritance. The money remains, but the power has moved on to new families, new schemes, and new sins. If you want to see which dynasty falls next, subscribe. The Kennedy fortune is no longer a monolithic force. It is a ghost, a fragmented memory scattered across hundreds of heirs and shielded by layers of private family offices. The massive engines of wealth that Joseph Sr. built to fuel a political machine have been dismantled. The crown jewel, the Merchandise Mart in Chicago, once the largest building in the world, was sold off for over $600 million. The money didn't vanish, it simply went quiet. It retreated from the front pages and into the sterile safety of diversified index funds and global nonprofit foundations. The modern Kennedys have traded the pursuit of the Oval Office for the safety of the boardroom and the charity gala. They are no longer a dynasty, they are a brand. The family office in Park Avenue manages a portfolio that would make a sovereign wealth fund blush, but it no longer buys elections, it buys stability. The aggressive, predatory DNA of the founder has been diluted by generations of trust funds and the crushing weight of public tragedy. When you look at the survivors today, you don't see the hungry wolves of the 1920s. You see authors, environmental activists, and minor diplomats. The fire that burned through the 20th century has been reduced to a flickering candle. The ambition that once demanded the world has been replaced by a desperate need for privacy. They realized, far too late, that the more space you occupy in the public consciousness, the larger the target on your back becomes. The vacuum left by their exit from the center of power is profound. For 70 years, the name Kennedy was the gold standard of American influence. Now, it is a cautionary tale for the new elite. The Silicon Valley billionaires and the hedge fund titans look at the Kennedy trajectory and see the ultimate failure of legacy planning. You can build a financial fortress. You can buy the finest medical care and the most expensive lawyers. You can even buy the history books, but you cannot buy protection from the psychological fallout of extreme expectation. Joseph Sr. believed he was building a staircase to the stars for his children. In reality, he was building a gallows. Every dollar he made through market manipulation and bootlegging carried a hidden tax, a tax that was paid in the blood of his sons and the sanity of his daughters. The empire is gone because the philosophy that built it was unsustainable. You cannot treat human beings like assets in a high-stakes portfolio without something breaking. The medical file from 1944 proved that the family was physically decaying even as they reached for the sun. The Addison's disease, the botched surgeries, the reckless flights into the dark, these weren't accidents. They were the symptoms of a family trying to outrun a shadow that was attached to their own feet. The Kennedy curse isn't mystical. It is a mathematical certainty. When you combine infinite wealth with infinite risk and a total disregard for the laws of physics and morality, the result is always zero. Today, the mansions in Hyannisport stand as museums of a lost era. The private jets are gone. The movie star mistresses are a memory. The world has moved on to new dynasties and new scandals, but the lesson remains etched in the history of the American century. Wealth is not a shield. It is a lightning rod. The Kennedys proved that you can conquer the world, but you will eventually have to face the vacuum created by your own success. Gravity is the only force that never loses a trade. It doesn't matter how much money is in the safe deposit box if the person holding the key is already gone. Wealth is a weapon that usually recoils on the person firing it. The Kennedys bought the world, only to realize the world was too heavy to hold. They are the ultimate proof that in the game of power, the house always wins. And the house doesn't take cash. It takes everything. If you want to see which dynasty is the next to hit the ground, you need to watch the people who think they've finally beaten the odds. Because the higher they climb,